Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Imagine being married to a millionaire, living in a mansion, yet feeling utterly worthless. Alice lived this reality every day. Her husband's mistress, Lilith, a woman draped in designer labels, openly mocked Alice's simple clothes, her quiet nature, her very existence. But at the city's most glamorous charity gala, the laughter stopped. When Alice walked in, not as the timid wife everyone knew, but as a vision in rare couture, her husband froze. What he saw wasn't just a dress. It was a ghost from his past and a secret she had kept for a decade. This is the story of how a woman's quiet rebellion shattered a gilded empire. Before we begin, take a moment and comment your city below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from around the world. Now, let's dive in. The silence in the penthouse was a living entity. It breathed in the sterile, conditioned air and settled over the vast expanses of white marble and glass like a fine, invisible dust. For Alice, the silence was a language she had learned to interpret with painful fluency. It spoke of absence, of conversations happening elsewhere, of a life being lived just beyond the soundproofed walls of her gilded cage. Her husband, Vincent Montgomery, was a man who commanded noise. His world was a cacophony of ringing phones, urgent meetings, and the booming pronouncements of a man who believed the universe bent to the sheer volume of his will. Yet when he was home, or more accurately, when he passed through the penthouse between his real life and his other life, the silence was his weapon of choice. It was a calculated, dismissive quiet that rendered Alice as much a part of the minimalist decor as the abstract sculptures he'd paid a fortune for but never truly looked at. Today, the silence was particularly loud. Vincent was preparing for the annual Montgomery Foundation Gala, the crown jewel of his philanthropic endeavors and the most important social event of the year in their city. Alice was, as always, expected to be a silent, smiling accessory on his arm. She stood before the full-length mirror in their cavernous walk-in closet, a space larger than the apartment she'd lived in before him. Racks of designer clothes, most unworn, stood like a silent, accusing army. Vincent's stylist had sent over a selection of gowns for her weeks ago. They were all beautiful, all exquisitely expensive, and all felt like costumes for a role she no longer had the heart to play. They were Vincent's taste, bold, modern, and designed to be noticed. They were not her. She ran her hand over a sequined silver sheath. It was cold to the touch, like Vincent's affection. She remembered the day she'd met him. She was a junior archivist at the City Museum, passionate about history, about the stories woven into the fabric of forgotten things. He had been a major donor, touring the textile restoration department. He'd been charmed, he'd said, by her quiet intelligence and her unassuming beauty. Looking back, Alice realized he'd been charmed by her malleability. He saw a beautiful blank canvas onto which he could paint his ideal wife, and for a time, she had let him. Overwhelmed by his charisma, his power, and the sheer velocity of his world, she had folded herself into the shape he desired. She'd left her job, her small circle of friends, her life's passions, to become Mrs. Vincent Montgomery. The price of admission to his world was her own. The faint chime of the private elevator announced an arrival. Not Vincent. His footsteps were heavy, authoritative. This was a lighter, more delicate sound, followed by a peal of laughter that scraped against the quiet of the apartment like nails on a chalkboard. "Lilith!" Alice's hand stilled on the silver dress. Her heart didn't race anymore. It just sank, a familiar, heavy weight in her chest. Lilith Vance was Vincent's protégée, a title as transparent as the glass walls of the penthouse. She was an artist whose career Vincent had single-handedly launched. She was everything Alice was not: vibrant, audacious, and utterly unapologetic. Her presence in their home was the ultimate humiliation, a constant glittering reminder of Alice's inadequacy. She heard their voices from the main living area, Vincent's low rumble and Lilith's theatrical soprano. "Vince, darling, you can't be serious about this one." Lilith's voice dripped with amused disdain. Alice knew, without seeing, that she was referring to the gala's new branding, or the catering, or some other detail Vincent had agonized over. Lilith had an opinion on everything, and Vincent, a man who listened to no one, listened to her. Alice closed her eyes, her reflection a pale, somber woman surrounded by meaningless luxury. She wore a simple gray cashmere sweater and dark trousers. It was her uniform within these walls, a deliberate retreat from the vibrant performance of being Mrs. Montgomery. It was in these clothes that she felt most herself, and it was for these clothes that Lilith mocked her the most. She had once overheard her talking to Vincent on the phone, her voice carrying from his study. "Honestly, darling, does she own anything with color? It's like living with a chic little rain cloud." Vincent hadn't defended her. There had only been a low chuckle, a sound that had chipped another piece from Alice's heart. Steeling herself, she walked out of the closet and towards the living area. The vast room, with its panoramic views of the city skyline, felt like a stage. Vincent stood by the bar, pouring 2 glasses of champagne. Lilith was perched on the edge of the white leather sofa, a vision in a scarlet dress that clung to her like a second skin. Her jet-black hair was a stark contrast to the room's muted palette. She was a slash of vibrant color in Alice's monochrome world. Lilith's eyes, sharp and intelligent, landed on Alice. A slow, condescending smile spread across her perfect lips. "Ah, there she is," she said, her voice silky smooth. "Just in time. We were just discussing the gala." She looked Alice up and down, her gaze lingering on the simple sweater. "Decided what you're wearing, darling. I do hope it's not another one of your quiet little numbers. People might think Vincent's fortune is in trouble." Vincent turned, a glass of champagne in his hand. He had the decency to look momentarily uncomfortable, but he said nothing. His silence was his complicity. It was his endorsement of the cruelty. Alice's gaze met his. For a fleeting second, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it guilt? Or just annoyance at this domestic friction? She had stopped trying to decipher him long ago. "I have it handled, Lilith," Alice said, her voice even, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. Lilith laughed, a tinkling, artificial sound. "Oh, I'm sure you do. Vincent, you must see the gown I've had commissioned. It's a De La Renta, an absolute masterpiece. We'll be the talk of the town." "We." The word hung in the air, a deliberate, poisoned dart aimed directly at Alice. "We will be the talk of the town." Alice was not part of that "we." She was the shadow that would trail behind them. "I'm sure it's lovely," Alice murmured, turning to retreat back to the sanctuary of her closet. "Don't run away," Vincent said, his voice holding a command she was expected to obey. "Have a drink with us." He held out a glass. It wasn't a peace offering, it was a power play. "Stay. Endure this. Be the good wife." Alice looked at the glass, then back at his face. For 10 years, she had accepted the glass. She had swallowed the champagne, the insults, the loneliness. She had played her part in this silent, agonizing play. But something was different today. Perhaps it was the way the silver dress felt beneath her fingers, a symbol of a life that wasn't hers. Perhaps it was the casual, brutal cruelty of that one. Simple word. We. Or perhaps it was the knowledge of what lay hidden in the back of her closet, tucked away in a vintage garment bag, waiting for its moment. She gave him a small, enigmatic smile. "No thank you, Vincent," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I have some things to attend to before this evening." She turned and walked away. the echo of her own quiet footsteps a stark contrast to the ringing laughter of his mistress. In the silence of her retreat, a rebellion was beginning to stir. It was a quiet rebellion, born of a decade of slights, but it was a rebellion nonetheless. And tonight, it would finally find its voice. The hours leading up to the gala were a slow, deliberate ritual for Alice. It was a process not of beautification, but of fortification. She drew a bath, sinking into the hot, scented water, and let the steam cloud the cold, hard surfaces of the marble bathroom. Here, in this private space, she allowed the mask to slip. The serene composure she wore like a shield dissolved, revealing the raw, bruised heart beneath. She thought of the woman she used to be, the archivist who found joy in the delicate rustle of aging paper, whose greatest thrill was discovering a forgotten diary or a collection of letters that told a story no one else had heard. She had a voice then. It was a quiet voice, yes, but it was her own. She gave lectures at the museum, wrote small articles for historical journals. Her life was her own creation, modest but deeply fulfilling. Vincent had swept into that life like a hurricane, dazzling and destructive. He had loved the idea of her, the old soul in a modern world. He collected her, just as he collected art and rare books. She was his most prized acquisition, a testament to his discerning taste. But like all his possessions, once acquired, she was relegated to a pristine shelf, to be admired from a distance, but never truly engaged with. The power imbalance had been there from the start, but she had been too blinded by the whirlwind romance to see it. He was the sun. She was expected to be a pale, orbiting moon. Her dreams, her passions, her very identity were slowly eclipsed by his overwhelming brilliance. The betrayal wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a slow erosion, a death by 1,000 tiny cuts. It was the canceled dates because a deal was more important. It was the dismissive wave of his hand when she tried to talk about her work. It was the arrival of Lilith, the final undeniable proof that she was not, and had never been, enough. Why had she stayed? That was the question that haunted her sleepless nights. At first it was love, or what she had mistaken for love. Then it was hope, a foolish, desperate belief that the man she had fallen for was still there, buried beneath layers of arrogance and ambition. Then it became fear. Vincent's power was immense. He had isolated her so completely that the world outside their penthouse felt alien and terrifying. He controlled the finances, the social circle, her very existence. Leaving felt like stepping off a cliff into an abyss. But there was another reason, a deeper, more complex one. It was a secret she had guarded for 10 years, a secret that was both a burden and a source of hidden strength. It was the real reason she had never truly fought back, why she had absorbed the pain and the humiliation in silence. It was a long game, a strategy born of desperation, and tonight she was finally ready to make her move. She stepped out of the bath, her resolve hardening with each drop of water that evaporated from her skin. She bypassed the rack of gowns Vincent's stylist had chosen. She walked to the very back of the closet, to a section hidden behind a row of winter coats. There, hanging in an opaque, archival-quality garment bag, was her armor. She unzipped the bag. The scent of cedar and old silk filled the air. Inside, nestled in layers of acid-free tissue paper, was the dress. It was not a modern creation of sequins and flash. It was a piece of history. A vintage Madame Grey gown from the late 1950s. A masterpiece of sculpted jersey, the color of a stormy sea, with intricate hand-pleated drapery that fell in a way that was both classical and breathtakingly modern. It was a dress that didn't scream for attention. It commanded it with a whisper of pure, unadulterated elegance. But it wasn't just a dress. It was a story. Her story. And though he didn't know it, it was Vincent's story, too. Her grandmother, a woman of quiet strength and impeccable taste, had been a house model for Madame Grey in Paris for a brief time before the war. This gown was one of the last pieces she had acquired, a gift from the legendary couturier herself. It had been passed down to Alice's mother, and then to her. It was her most precious inheritance, a tangible link to the strong, independent women in her lineage. It was the antithesis of everything Vincent and Lilith stood for. It represented legacy, not novelty. Substance, not surface. She had worn it once, long before she met Vincent, to a small museum benefit. A young, ambitious photographer had taken her picture. That picture had ended up in a society magazine, a small, forgotten image in a sea of faces. A magazine she knew for a fact that Vincent's mother, a woman he both revered and resented, had collected obsessively. This was Alice's hidden motive, the psychological gambit she had been waiting years to play. Vincent's relationship with his late mother, a formidable and critical woman, was the key to his entire psyche. He spent his life trying to both escape her shadow and win her posthumous approval. He had built his empire to prove her wrong, yet he craved the validation she had always withheld. Alice knew that Vincent had never seen that photograph. He had never seen her in that dress. But she suspected, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he had seen the dress itself. His mother, a collector of haute couture, had owned a sister gown, identical in every way. It had been her most treasured possession, the one she wore to the most important events of her life. The one she was wearing in the last portrait ever painted of her, a portrait that now hung in the grim ancestral home Vincent refused to sell but could never bring himself to visit. Tonight, Alice wasn't just wearing a dress. She was wearing a memory. She was becoming a ghost. She did her own hair and makeup, a departure from the team of professionals Vincent usually hired. She styled her hair in a simple, elegant chignon, reminiscent of the 1950s, and kept her makeup understated, letting the dress be the focus. She wore no jewelry except for her grandmother's small diamond and sapphire earrings, their deep blue color echoing the stormy hue of the gown. When she was ready, she looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was not the timid gray wife. She was not a rain cloud. She was the storm itself. The dress clung to her, the masterful pleats accentuating her form, making her look both powerful and graceful. She looked like she belonged in a museum, a piece of art come to life. And in a way, she was. She was a living, breathing piece of history, and she was about to rewrite it. She heard the chime of the elevator again. Vincent was back. He would be expecting her in one of the modern, flashy gowns. He would be expecting the pale moon to his brilliant sun. Taking a deep breath, she opened the bedroom door and walked out to face him. The first move in her long game was about to be made. The Montgomery Foundation Gala was held at the city's Grand Museum of Art, a place Alice had once considered a second home. Tonight, it felt like a battlefield. The soaring marble atrium was filled with the city's elite. Titans of industry, political figures, and the artists and socialites who orbited them. The air hummed with false laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. It was a sea of glittering surfaces, and Alice knew that just beneath, the sharks were circling. She and Vincent had arrived separately, a small but significant break in their usual protocol. Vincent had been called away for a last-minute business emergency, a transparent excuse she knew was a rendezvous with Lilith to coordinate their grand entrance. Alice had insisted she was fine taking a separate car, a request Vincent had granted with surprised, almost relieved compliance. He wanted her there, but on his terms, in his shadow. Her quiet independence tonight was a minor anomaly, one he hadn't yet registered as a threat. Alice entered not through the main red-carpeted entrance, but through a discreet side door, a privilege of her former life as an archivist. She wanted to observe before being observed. From the balcony overlooking the main hall, she saw them. Vincent stood at the center of the most powerful group in the room, holding court. He was magnetic, exuding an aura of power that drew people to him like moths to a flame, and at his side, practically fused to his arm, was Lilith. She was, as promised, a masterpiece of modern design. Her de la Renta gown was a confection of crimson ruffles and exposed skin, audacious and impossible to ignore. Her laughter was the loudest in the room, her gestures grand and theatrical. She was playing the part of the queen, and the court was enthralled. Alice watched as Lilith leaned in to whisper something in Vincent's ear. He threw his head back and laughed. Then Lilith's eyes began to scan the room, a predatory gleam in them. She was looking for Alice. She was looking for her prey. Their gazes met across the crowded hall. Lilith's smile was a slow, triumphant curl of her lips. She lifted her champagne glass in a mock toast, a gesture of pure, condescending victory. Then she turned to the woman next to her, a notorious gossip columnist, and gestured subtly with her head towards the balcony. Alice could almost hear the words, the familiar, cutting remarks about the poor, drab Mrs. Montgomery. The columnist laughed, a shrill, unpleasant sound. The mockery had begun. This was it. This was the moment. Alice turned from the balcony and descended the grand, sweeping staircase. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace she hadn't felt in years. She did not rush. She let the moment build. A few heads turned at first, drawn by the unusual sight of a woman descending the main staircase alone. Then a few more. A ripple of whispers began to spread through the crowd, a different sound from the usual din of party chatter. It was a murmur of confusion, then of dawning recognition, then of outright awe. The dress was doing its work. It was unlike anything else in the room. In a sea of modern architectural gowns and glittering sequins, its timeless elegance was a revelation. The sculpted jersey flowed around her like liquid stone, the color of the deep ocean just before a storm. It didn't shout. It spoke in a language of pure, unassailable style. The crowd began to part for her, an unconscious, instinctual reaction. The sea of people seemed to recede, creating a natural path for her as she approached the center of the room. She kept her eyes fixed on one point. Her husband. Lilith was the first to see her clearly. She was in the middle of a story, her hands gesturing wildly. She faltered, her words trailing off as she saw the figure gliding towards them, her brow furrowed in confusion. This couldn't be the dowdy, gray woman she so enjoyed tormenting. This woman was magnificent. Then her eyes narrowed, a flicker of disbelief followed by a flash of pure, unadulterated fury. She recognized the power of the statement being made. This was a challenge, a declaration of war. Her smile tightened, becoming a venomous slash of red lipstick. She leaned into Vincent, her voice a poisonous whisper meant only for him. But Alice could read the intent on her face. My God, what is she wearing? Did she rob a museum? It looks ancient. Vincent, still laughing at some joke, turned his head, his expression one of indulgent curiosity. He followed Lilith's gaze, and then he saw her. The world stopped. For Vincent Montgomery, a man who never faltered, a man whose entire life was built on forward momentum, time itself seemed to fracture. The blood drained from his face. The easy, confident smile vanished, replaced by a mask of slack-jawed shock. His eyes, which had just been crinkled with laughter, were now wide, fixed, and filled with a dawning horror. He wasn't seeing his wife, Alice. He was seeing his mother. He was seeing the formidable, unpleasable matriarch of his youth, standing before him as if resurrected from the grave. He was seeing the gown from the portrait in the decaying ancestral home. the gown that represented all his childhood feelings of inadequacy, his desperate failed attempts to earn her love. The gown that was a symbol of the old world power and legacy he had tried to simultaneously replicate and destroy. His mind couldn't process it. The two images, the quiet, compliant wife and the terrifying, judgmental mother, collided in his brain with the force of a physical blow. The champagne glass, forgotten in his hand, slipped from his grasp. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, explosive crash that echoed through the suddenly silent atrium. Shatter. The sound broke the spell. Every eye in the room, which had been on Alice, now snapped to Vincent. They saw the frozen, ashen-faced millionaire, the shattered glass at his feet, and the woman in the storm-colored gown who had brought him to a complete standstill. Alice stopped just a few feet from them. She didn't smile. She didn't say a word. She simply held his gaze, her expression calm, her eyes clear and steady. In that moment, the power imbalance that had defined their entire marriage was not just leveled, it was inverted. Lilith, recovering from her own shock, rushed to his side. "Vincent, darling, are you all right?" Her voice was laced with a frantic edge. She shot Alice a look of pure hatred. "What have you done?" she hissed. But Vincent didn't hear her. He couldn't take his eyes off Alice. The ghost of his mother, the shame of his past, the wife he had so carelessly underestimated. It was all there, embodied in the woman standing before him. "The dress," he finally whispered, his voice hoarse, unrecognizable. Where did you get that dress?" Alice allowed a small, cool smile to touch her lips. It was a smile he had never seen before. It was the smile of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. "It's vintage," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the profound silence. "It's been in my family for a very long time." Her words were simple, truthful, and utterly devastating. The implication was clear. This was not a copy. This was not a coincidence. This was a part of her history. A history he had never bothered to learn. A history that, tonight, had collided with his own with the force of a wrecking ball. The gilded cage had just been shattered, and the woman he thought he owned was finally, terrifyingly, free. The ride home was a symphony of suffocating silence. The custom-built Maybach, usually a sanctuary of quiet luxury for Vincent, felt like a tomb. He sat rigid, staring out the window at the blurred city lights, his face a pale, taut mask. Alice sat opposite him, the magnificent folds of the Madame Grey gown pooling around her. The storm had passed, leaving a landscape of wreckage in its wake. The moment they stepped into the penthouse, the fragile truce shattered. "Take it off." The words were low, guttural, torn from somewhere deep inside him. It wasn't a request. It was a desperate, ragged command. Alice looked at him, her calm demeanor unwavering. "I'm sorry?" "The dress," he bit out, turning to face her, his eyes wild with a mixture of fury and a strange, unnerving fear. "Take it off. Now." "No," she said simply. Her voice didn't waver. It was the first time in their marriage she had denied him so directly, so absolutely. The word, small as it was, landed in the space between them with the weight of an anvil. Vincent looked as if she had struck him. "What did you say?" "I said no, Vincent." She walked past him, towards the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering, indifferent city. "I think I'll wear it for a little while longer." He followed her, his movements jerky, uncoordinated. All the smooth, confident power he projected to the world had been stripped away, leaving behind a raw, exposed nerve. "This is a game to you, isn't it? Some kind of sick, twisted game? You did this to humiliate me." Alice turned slowly, her expression one of weary sadness. "Humiliate you? Vincent, for the last 10 years, my life has been a study in humiliation. A quiet, private, soul-crushing humiliation that you either orchestrated or willfully ignored. Tonight was not about humiliating you. It was about reminding you that I exist. By dressing up as my mother? He scoffed, the sound harsh and broken. What kind of psychological warfare is that? It wasn't warfare. It was history. She corrected him gently. That dress belonged to my grandmother. It was given to her by Madame Grey herself. It is a part of my story, a story you never once showed the slightest interest in hearing. He stared at her, his mind reeling. Your grandmother? That's impossible. My mother. She had that dress. It was identical. I know, Alice said. I've seen the portrait. I've known about it for years. The confession hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Vincent's face contorted as the implications crashed down on him. The years of her quietness, her passivity, her acceptance of Lilith. It hadn't been weakness. It had been observation. It had been strategy. You knew, he whispered, the anger draining out of him, replaced by a chilling bewilderment. All this time, you knew. Why? This was the moment, the culmination of a decade of pain. Alice took a breath, the carefully constructed walls around her heart finally beginning to crumble. Not in defeat, but in release. Why? She repeated, a bitter, humorless laugh escaping her lips. You want to know why? Because when I met you, I fell in love with a man I thought was brilliant and strong. And I was so in love, I didn't see that his strength was just a shield for the most profound weakness. You are terrified, Vincent. You are terrified of not being the most powerful man in the room. You are terrified of your own past. And most of all, you are terrified of your mother's ghost. He flinched as if she had physically slapped him. I saw it early on, she continued, her voice gaining strength, fueled by years of suppressed truth. The way you talked about her, the mixture of rage and a desperate need for her approval. I saw how you built this entire empire on a foundation of, I'll show her. You didn't build it for you or for us. You built it for a ghost. You don't know anything about my mother, he snarled, a reflexive defense. I know she was a collector of couture, Alice countered, her voice cutting through his denial. I know she was critical and demanding. And I know that seeing that dress on me tonight was like seeing your own personal failure staring you in the face. Because in your mind, only a woman of her stature, of her power, was worthy of wearing it. And you have never, not for 1 second, considered me worthy of anything. The truth of her words was a physical force, knocking the air from his lungs. He sank onto the edge of the white leather sofa, the same spot where Lilith had sat just hours before, laughing at Alice's expense. He looked small, diminished, a king dethroned in his own castle. And Lilith... Alice's voice was soft now, but laced with steel. Did you think I didn't understand what she was? She isn't your lover, Vincent. Not really. She's your cheerleader. She's the anti-mother. She praises everything you do, validates every decision, tells you you're a god among men. She is the antidote to the poison your mother fed you. But it's just another crutch, another way to avoid looking at the real, terrified man inside. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The sound of his ragged breathing filled the silence. He was unraveling, thread by thread, right before her eyes. I stayed, Vincent, she said, her voice thick with emotion, because I held on to a foolish hope that one day you would see me. Not the accessory, not the quiet wife, but the woman who saw all of your broken pieces, and for some insane reason still loved you. I thought if I was patient, if I was quiet, you would eventually feel safe enough to stop performing. But you never did. The performance became the man. She walked over to him, standing before his slumped figure. Tonight I finally realized. You will never see me as long as I remain in your shadow. So I had to step into a light you couldn't ignore. I had to wear the one thing, the one memory that you could never, ever dismiss. He looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed, filled with a despair she had never seen. "What have I done?" he whispered to the floor. "You built a beautiful cage," she answered, her voice trembling slightly. "And you forgot you locked a person inside." She turned and walked towards their bedroom, the silk of the gown whispering against the marble floor. She didn't look back. The confrontation was over. The secrets were out. The long, painful process of picking up the pieces, or walking away from them entirely, had just begun. The days that followed the gala were a strange, suspended limbo. The penthouse, once a place of oppressive silence, was now filled with a different kind of quiet, one of heavy, unspoken questions. Vincent moved through the rooms like a phantom, his usual booming confidence replaced by a hesitant, uncertain energy. He had canceled all his meetings. He had stopped taking calls. For the first time in his adult life, the relentless engine of his ambition had ground to a halt. Lilith had tried to breach the new quiet, of course. She had called, texted, even shown up at the private elevator, demanding to be let in. Vincent had refused. Through the intercom, Alice had heard him tell her, his voice flat and lifeless, "I need some time, Lilith. Just leave it." The click of the elevator doors closing on his mistress was a sound more final than any argument. Alice, meanwhile, felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in a decade. The act of wearing the dress had been more than a strategic move. It had been a reclamation. She had taken back her own narrative. She spent her days rediscovering the woman she had put on hold. She pulled out her old books on textile history, the pages fragrant with the scent of her former life. She contacted the museum, speaking to her old supervisor, a woman who greeted her with warmth and surprise, and they made plans for lunch. Each small step back towards her own world felt like a monumental victory. The dress now hung not in the back of the closet, but in a place of honor, on a dress form in the corner of her sitting room. It was a silent sentinel, a reminder of the power she had found in her own history. One evening, nearly a week after the gala, she found Vincent standing before it. He wasn't looking at the dress itself, but through it, at something far away. "I went to the house today," he said without turning around. Alice knew which house he meant. The sprawling Gothic estate on the Hudson he had inherited from his parents. The house that was more museum than home, filled with ghosts and expectations. "I haven't been inside in 15 years, he continued, his voice low and raspy. "Not since the funeral." He finally turned to look at her. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, painful vulnerability. "I stood in front of her portrait, the one of her in the dress. I stood there for 3 hours, just looking at it." He walked towards the bar, but instead of pouring a scotch, he just leaned against it, his hands gripping the cold marble edge. "I never saw her smile in that dress, not once. She wore it like armor. It was her uniform for battle, for board meetings, for charity events where she would tear apart her rivals with a quiet word. It was the dress she wore when she was her most formidable, her most terrifying." He looked back at Alice. "And then I thought of you. At the gala. You weren't terrifying. You were serene. You looked like you belonged in it. You looked strong, but you didn't look cruel. My mother wore it to conquer the world. You wore it to find yourself." It was the most perceptive thing he had ever said to her. A flicker of the intelligent, observant man she had first fallen for shone through the cracks of his broken facade. "She was a brilliant woman, my mother," Vincent murmured, more to himself than to her. But she was deeply unhappy. Her marriage was a business arrangement. Her life was a series of strategic victories. She saw love as a weakness, emotion as a liability. She tried to beat it out of me. She wanted me to be a Montgomery, not a person. Strong, unflinching, ruthless. He finally pushed himself off the bar and walked towards Alice, stopping a few feet away. The space between them felt sacred, fragile. "When I met you," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears, "I felt peace. It was the first time in my life I hadn't felt like I was on a battlefield. You're quiet, you're calm. It was a balm to me. I told myself I was saving you from your small life, bringing you into my world. But that was a lie." He took another step closer. "The truth is, I was terrified of your world. I was terrified of the quiet, of the genuine emotion. It felt dangerous. It was everything she taught me to despise. So I tried to change you. I tried to make you a part of my world, the world of noise and surfaces and power. I put you in this glass box and surrounded you with things I thought you should want, because I was too much of a coward to enter your world and learn what you actually wanted. Lilith." He shook his head, a look of self-disgust on his face. "You were right. She was my drug. An ego boost on demand. Every time I felt that old fear, that old feeling of being the inadequate little boy in the face of my mother's disapproval, I would run to her. And she would tell me I was a king. It was easy. It was hollow. And it was a profound betrayal of you." He looked directly into her eyes, and for the first time she saw not a millionaire, not a titan of industry, but just a man, a broken, lost man. "The night of the gala," he said, his voice cracking. "When I saw you in that dress, it was like my whole life flashed before my eyes. The ghost I'd been running from was suddenly standing right in front of me. But it had your face. The face of the one person I had wronged the most. The one person who had seen all of my ugliness and, for some reason I will never understand, had stayed." He reached out, his hand hesitating in the air, before gently, tentatively, touching her arm. His touch was not one of ownership, but of pleading. "I don't know if it's possible," he whispered. "I don't know if I deserve it, but I want to start over. Not here. Not in this mausoleum." He gestured around the penthouse. "I want to sell this place. I want to sell the company. I have more money than 10 people could spend in a lifetime. It means nothing. It's just armor, just like that dress was for her." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "I want to learn your story, Alice. I want to know about your grandmother. I want to go to museums with you, not as a donor, but as a student. I want to hear your voice again, the one I tried so hard to silence." Tears streamed down Alice's face. They were not tears of sadness, but of a deep, cathartic release. The man she had mourned for years was standing before her. He was not perfect. He was shattered. But he was finally, breathtakingly, real. She didn't have an answer for him. Not yet. The wounds were too deep. The years of pain too long to be erased by a single, heartfelt confession. But as he stood there, stripped of all his power and pretense, offering her the broken pieces of himself, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. A fragile, terrifying, but undeniably real hope. The path to redemption would be long and uncertain, but for the first time, it seemed possible. She reached up and placed her hand over his. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the weight of everything that had been said, and everything that was yet to come. The dismantling of an empire, Alice discovered, was a much quieter affair than its construction. There were no grand pronouncements, no triumphant headlines. There was only a series of quiet, decisive actions. Vincent, true to his word, began the process of selling Montgomery Industries. He handed over the reins to his board, taking on a silent partnership role. His withdrawal from the day-to-day operations sending quiet shockwaves through the financial world. He sold the penthouse. The white marble and glass cage was put on the market and snapped up within days. They moved, not to another, smaller mansion, but to a historic brownstone in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, a house with worn wooden floors, a small, overgrown garden, and walls that seemed to hold the warmth of past lives. It was a house that had character, not just a price tag. For Alice, it felt like coming home. She filled the rooms with books, with textiles, with pieces of art that she loved. Not for their value, but for the stories they told. She took over the garden, her hands finding a deep satisfaction in the simple, honest work of tending to the earth. Vincent watched her, a quiet, constant observer. He was a man adrift. Having shed the armor of his corporate identity, he seemed unsure of his own shape. He was accustomed to a life of schedules, of demands, of being the center of gravity. Now, his days were unstructured, his phone was silent. He was learning to live in the quiet. He began to accompany Alice on her visits to the museum. At first, he was awkward, a giant in a world of delicate things. He would stand stiffly beside her as she spoke with curators, his hands shoved in his pockets. But slowly, he began to listen. He listened as she explained the provenance of a medieval tapestry, her voice alive with a passion he hadn't heard in years. He listened as she described the painstaking process of restoring a fragile piece of lace. He started to ask questions, timidly at first, then with genuine curiosity. He was learning a new language, a language of history, of art, of things that mattered beyond profit margins and market shares. He was learning her language. One afternoon, they were in the museum's archives, a place Alice now visited as a consulting historian. She was showing him a collection of letters from a 19th-century merchant to his wife. He was away for years at a time, Alice explained, her fingers gently tracing the faded script. These letters were their only connection. He describes the silks he's buying in China, the colors, the textures. But what's really beautiful is that he's not just describing the goods. He's trying to share his world with her. He's trying to make her see what he sees. Vincent looked at the delicate paper, at the elegant, looping handwriting. He was trying to close the distance, he said, his voice quiet. Alice looked up at him, her heart giving a small, hopeful flutter. Yes, she said. He was. The path to redemption was not a straight line. There were difficult days, days when Vincent's old arrogance would flare up, a reflexive defense against his own vulnerability. Days when the memory of Lilith, of the years of casual cruelty, would rise up in Alice like a bitter tide, and she would have to retreat into herself, the wall of her pain too high for him to climb. They talked. For the first time in their marriage, they truly talked. They talked about his mother, about his childhood, about the immense pressure that had shaped him. And Alice talked about her loneliness, about the slow, painful erasure of her identity. The conversations were often painful, punctuated by long silences and shed tears. But they were honest. They were building a new foundation, not on wealth or power, but on the treacherous, fertile ground of shared vulnerability. One day, a large, flat package arrived. It was addressed to Alice. Inside was a framed photograph. It was the picture of her, taken all those years ago, the one from the Society magazine. The young woman in the Madame Grey gown, her expression hopeful and unguarded. Vincent came to stand beside her as she looked at it. I had a private investigator find it, he said softly. I wanted to see it. I needed to see the woman I failed to notice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. It was not a flashy, ostentatious piece of jewelry. He opened it. Inside was a simple, elegant locket, vintage and silver. "It's not much," he said, his voice unsteady. "Not compared to what I used to give you." Alice took the locket. It was beautiful, understated, and timeless. It was her. "I want you to have it," he said. "As a promise. A promise that from now on, I will see you. The woman in this photograph. The woman who loves history. The woman who can bring a garden back to life. Not Mrs. Montgomery. Just Alice." She opened the locket. On one side, he had placed a tiny, perfectly cropped image of her grandmother. On the other side, there was space. A space for a new picture. A space for a new story. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked from the locket to his face. The journey was far from over. Trust, once so completely shattered, would take a long time to rebuild. But for the first time, she believed it was possible. The wealth they were building now was not one of money or possessions. It was a different kind of wealth, one measured in shared stories, in honest conversations, in the quiet, patient work of healing. It was the kind of wealth that could, perhaps, truly last a lifetime. A year passed. The seasons turned, painting the leaves in their quiet garden in hues of gold and crimson before blanketing it in snow, and then coaxing it back to life with the tender green of spring. Life in the brownstone was quiet, rhythmic, and real. Alice had accepted a permanent position at the museum, not as a donor's wife, but as the head of textile archives and restoration. She had a team, a budget, and the respect of her colleagues. Her days were filled with purpose. She gave lectures again, her voice once a hesitant whisper, now clear and confident. She was publishing her research, her name, Alice Beaumont, becoming known in her field. She was, once again, the author of her own life. Vincent had found a new purpose. 2. He had channeled his formidable business acumen into the Montgomery Foundation, but he had reshaped its mission. He stepped away from the glitzy galas and the self-aggrandizing projects. The foundation now focused on funding smaller, grassroots organizations, historical preservation societies, arts education in underserved communities, scholarships for students in the humanities. He worked not from a towering office, but from a small study in their brownstone, his calls now about grant proposals and community outreach, not corporate takeovers. He had become Alice's most ardent student and her biggest champion. He would sit in the front row of her lectures, his pride in her radiating from him. He learned the difference between damask and brocade. He could speak knowledgeably about the chemical processes of dye preservation. He had not just entered her world. He had chosen to make it his home. The Madame Grey gown was no longer on a dress form. Alice had it carefully preserved and donated it to the museum's permanent collection. Its story, of her grandmother, of her own journey, was now part of the public record, a testament to the fact that history is not just about grand events, but about the quiet, resilient lives of women. On the day it was unveiled in its new exhibition case, Vincent stood beside her, holding her hand, his eyes shining. Their relationship was not a fairy tale romance reborn. It was something quieter, deeper, and more profound. It was a conscious choice they made every day, a choice to listen, to be patient, to forgive, both each other and themselves. The scars of the past remained, not as open wounds, but as faint, silvery lines, reminders of the pain they had overcome and the strength they had found. The love between them was not the fiery, possessive passion of their early years, but a steady, warm flame nurtured by mutual respect and a hard-won intimacy. One sunny afternoon in early summer, Alice was in the garden, sketching the new blooms on a rose bush. Vincent came out to join her, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. He sat beside her on the simple wooden bench, the silence between them comfortable, easy. "I was thinking," he said, breaking the quiet, About the locket? Alice touched the silver locket at her throat. It was a constant presence, a comforting weight against her skin. The side opposite her grandmother's picture was still empty. "I know what picture should go in it," he said. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small photograph. It was a picture he had taken just a few weeks prior. They had been on a trip to the coast, walking along a wind-swept beach. In the photo, Alice was laughing, her head thrown back, the wind catching her hair. She wasn't wearing a designer gown or expensive jewels. She was wearing simple linen trousers and a worn sweater, her face open and filled with a joy that was pure and unscripted. She looked beautiful. She looked free. Alice gazed at the photograph, her heart full. This was the woman she had become. Not a ghost, not a victim, not a silent accessory, just herself. "It's perfect," she whispered. He smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. "I thought so." He paused, then took her hand. "I know I can never erase the years I lost, the years I failed to see you. But I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you know you are seen and cherished." Alice leaned her head on his shoulder, the scent of roses and warm earth all around them. The story of their past was written, a painful, complex chapter of betrayal and redemption. But as she looked at the empty space in the locket and the photograph of the laughing woman in her hand, she knew the best part of their story was still to come. It was an unwritten chapter, one they would write together, not in a gilded cage, but here, in the messy, beautiful, and authentic life they had built from the ruins. The future was not a foregone conclusion, but an open page. And for the first time, they were both holding the pen. Alice's story is a powerful reminder that our true value is never defined by the clothes we wear or the approval of others. It's a story about finding your voice in the silence, reclaiming your history, and having the courage to rewrite your own future. It shows that redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about learning from it to build a more authentic and meaningful life. True power isn't about wealth or control. It's about vulnerability, forgiveness, and the quiet strength it takes to heal. If this story of betrayal, resilience, and hard-won hope moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more emotional stories that explore the deep complexities of the human heart. Thank you for watching.